In the autumn of 1888, the streets of London's East End ran red with blood. A faceless predator stalked the night, his victims left mutilated beyond recognition. Over a century later, one question still haunts us. Who was Jack the Ripper? Welcome back to Vanished and Unsolved. If you're returning, thank you for joining me once again as we step into the shadows of history's darkest mysteries. And if you're new here, you're in the right place. This is where we explore chilling cases that remain unanswered, even decades or centuries later. Today, we travel back to Victorian London, to a place shrouded in fog and fear. A place where the gaslit streets of Whitechapel became a hunting ground for one of the most notorious killers the world has ever known. His crimes were brutal, his identity unknown, and his legacy eternal. But before we dive into this terrifying case, let me remind you, if you're fascinated by unsolved mysteries and you want to join a community that refuses to let these stories be forgotten, make sure you hit that subscribe button. You won't want to miss what's coming next. Now, let's step into Whitechapel, 1888, a district drowning in poverty, desperation, and shadows. The perfect stage for a killer to emerge. Before the name Jack the Ripper ever reached the newspapers, the streets of Whitechapel were already soaked with violence. On the night of April 3rd, 1888, a woman named Emma Smith was attacked on her way home. She was brutally assaulted by a gang of men, beaten, and left with horrific injuries that would claim her life the following day. Emma managed to describe her attackers before she died, but her case was ultimately ruled to be the work of local gangs extorting money from prostitutes. And yet, her violent death set the tone for the months that followed. Then came August 7th, 1888. A woman named Martha Tabram was found lying in a dark stairwell, stabbed an astonishing 39 times. The ferocity of the attack shocked even hardened London police officers. Unlike Emma Smith's case, this was no gang assault. Martha had been savagely butchered in silence, her body left sprawled in the shadows for others to discover. Some investigators believe that Martha may have been the Ripper's first true victim. Others argue she fell prey to a different killer. But one thing was clear, something sinister was stalking Whitechapel, and the violence was escalating. And soon, London would come face to face with a murderer whose name would never be forgotten. The attacks on Emma Smith and Martha Tabram were only the beginning. Just weeks later, London would wake to the horrors of the first official Ripper killing. It was the early hours of August 31st, 1888, when the body of Marion Nichols, known to friends as Polly, was discovered on a dark Whitechapel street. Her throat had been slashed so violently that she was nearly decapitated. Her abdomen bore deep, deliberate cuts, as though the killer wasn't satisfied with simply ending her life. Polly's murder marked the beginning of what history would call the reign of Jack the Ripper. Only 8 days later, the killer struck again. On September 8th, the mutilated body of Annie Chapman was found in the backyard of a Spitalfields house. Her throat was cut, her abdomen ripped open, and, most disturbingly, some of her organs were missing. Whoever killed Annie wasn't acting in a frenzy. He was working with precision, almost as if he had medical knowledge. Panic rippled through the East End. This was no ordinary killer. By the end of September, London was gripped by fear. And then came what would be known as the double event. On the night of September 30th, 1888, the Ripper claimed 2 victims within the span of an hour. The first was Elizabeth Stride, found with her throat cut. Unlike the others, there were no mutilations. Many believe the killer was interrupted, scared off before he could finish. But he would not be denied. Less than an hour later, the body of Catherine Eddowes was discovered. This time, the brutality was worse than ever before. Her face was slashed beyond recognition, and once again, her organs had been removed. The killer had returned to his pattern, but with even greater ferocity. London now knew that this was not a madman killing at random. This was someone who killed with purpose. And then came the final murder. On the morning of November 9th, 1888, in a small room on Miller's Court, the body of Mary Jane Kelly was found. What the police saw that day was beyond comprehension. Mary Jane's body was mutilated so savagely that even hardened detectives were left shaken. Her face was destroyed, her organs removed and scattered, her body almost unrecognizable as human. This was the killer's crescendo, the most horrific display of violence in the entire series. From August to November, 5 women had been slaughtered in the most grotesque fashion. These murders, now known as the Canonical Five, would forever cement the name Jack the Ripper in history. But the killings were only part of what made this case infamous. What came next would send London into a frenzy of fear and speculation, and turn this unknown killer into a legend. As the bodies piled up and fear consumed the streets of Whitechapel, the case took a darker, almost theatrical turn. Letters began arriving at police stations and newspaper offices, letters that claimed to be written by the killer himself. The most infamous of these was the Dear Boss letter, received in September of 1888. Written in red ink, it mocked the police for their failures and promised more bloodshed. The letter was signed with a chilling name that the world would never forget: Jack the Ripper. Soon after came another, more disturbing communication. A small package arrived addressed to George Lusk, the head of the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee, a group of local citizens who patrolled the streets in frustration with police incompetence. Inside was a note known as the From Hell letter, along with half of a human kidney. The letter taunted Lusk, claiming the sender had eaten the other half. The kidney was believed to come from one of the Ripper's victims, Catherine Eddowes, whose organ had been removed during her murder. The press seized on these letters, publishing them for the entire public to see. Overnight, the name Jack the Ripper spread across London, across Britain, and eventually the world. The killer was no longer just a shadow in the night. He was a persona, a legend in the making. But were these letters truly written by the killer, or were they cruel hoaxes, designed by journalists hungry for sales in a time of panic? Many experts now believe that most, if not all, were fakes. And yet, the damage was done. The name stuck, the fear multiplied, and Jack the Ripper became immortal. And while the world obsessed over the letters, the police continued their desperate hunt, turning their eyes to a growing list of suspects. After the brutal slaying of Mary Jane Kelly in November 1888, many wondered if the Ripper had finally vanished into the night. Was his work complete, or had he simply disappeared, imprisoned, institutionalized, or even dead? Yet the murders did not stop in Whitechapel. On December 20th, 1888, the body of Rose Milett was discovered. She had been strangled, but unlike the Canonical Five, her body showed no signs of mutilation. Some dismissed her death as unrelated, while others whispered that Jack had changed his methods to confuse the police. Months later, in July of 1889, another victim appeared, Alice Mackenzie. She too had her throat slashed, and while the mutilations were less severe than before, many detectives suspected the Ripper's hand once again. Then, in February of 1891, the body of Frances Coles was found beneath a railway arch, her throat cut, but her body left otherwise intact. She is often considered the final Ripper victim, though by this point, the legend had become so large that nearly every unsolved murder in Whitechapel was laid at his feet. Some investigators even linked Jack the Ripper to the mysterious Thames Torso murders, a series of killings where dismembered bodies were found in the river. The victims were different, their torsos dumped, their limbs missing, but the timing overlapped with the Ripper's reign. Could it have been the same killer, experimenting with different methods? Or was London simply home to more than one predator in those desperate years? The truth is that we may never know which victims were truly Jack's. But what we do know is that the fear he created lived on long after the last body was found. And as the death toll rose, so too did the frustration of a police force that seemed powerless to stop him. The streets were restless, the press relentless, and the public was demanding answers. Which brings us to the next chilling question. How did the investigators, with thousands of men, endless resources, and the eyes of the world upon them, still fail to catch Jack the Ripper? By the fall of 1888, London was in a state of hysteria. The Whitechapel murders dominated newspaper headlines, and the public demanded justice. Scotland Yard launched one of the largest manhunts in its history. Over 2,000 people were interviewed, more than 300 suspects were investigated, and dozens were held for questioning. But every lead seemed to collapse into dead ends. Inspector Frederick Aberline, one of the top detectives of Scotland Yard, was assigned to the case. A seasoned officer familiar with the East End, Aberline worked tirelessly, chasing rumors, interviewing witnesses, and following trails that all seemed to vanish into the fog. The police faced enormous challenges. There was no fingerprinting, no DNA testing, and no reliable forensic science. Crime scenes were often contaminated by curious crowds before investigators even arrived. And on top of that, the rivalry between the Metropolitan Police and the City of London Police meant cooperation was scarce. Instead of unity, there was division, and Jack the Ripper slipped through the cracks. Meanwhile, the public's distrust of the police grew. Vigilante groups patrolled the streets, convinced they could do better. The press ridiculed the authorities, publishing sensational theories that only deepened the panic. And if you're still with me here, I want to take a moment to say, these are the kinds of mysteries we uncover on Vanished and Unsolved. If you haven't already, make sure you subscribe so you never miss a case that still haunts history. Because the investigation into Jack the Ripper would only grow stranger, and the suspects? They were as chilling as the murders themselves. While the police struggled, doctors and early criminologists attempted something groundbreaking, trying to get inside the killer's mind. One of the first profiles came from Dr. Thomas Bond, a police surgeon who examined the victims. Bond suggested that Jack the Ripper was likely a man with no medical training but a violent, disturbed mind, someone who killed for the sheer pleasure of it. His report is often considered one of the earliest attempts at criminal profiling in history. Others disagreed, arguing the precision of the mutilations hinted at some surgical knowledge. Was the Ripper a butcher, a medical student, or perhaps a deranged doctor roaming Whitechapel's alleys at night? Each theory added fuel to the fire, but none brought Scotland Yard closer to an arrest. And the more experts tried to define the Ripper, the more his legend grew. Because if the killer truly blended into the daily life of Whitechapel, he could have been anyone. A neighbor, a passerby, even the man reading the newspapers about his own crimes. And just when the public thought they understood him, new suspects emerged, each more mysterious than the last. Over the years, Scotland Yard considered hundreds of suspects, but a few names stood out, men whose lives and habits seemed to fit the shadowy figure haunting Whitechapel. One of the most infamous was Montague John Druitt, a barrister and schoolteacher. After the last canonical murder in November 1888, Druitt vanished, only to be found dead in the Thames a month later. Some officers believed his suicide marked the end of the Ripper killings, but others doubted, wondering if Druitt had been nothing more than a troubled man who fit the timeline a little too conveniently. Then came Aaron Kosminski, a Polish-born barber living in Whitechapel. He was known to suffer from mental illness, and police records described his hatred of women and disturbing behavior. For decades, his name remained buried in police notes. Modern DNA testing has been controversially linked to Kosminski, but experts argue the evidence is far from conclusive. Another chilling possibility was Michael Ostrog, a Russian-born conman and thief with medical knowledge. His criminal record and violent past caught investigators' eyes, but little evidence truly tied him to the killings. And then there was Prince Albert Victor, the Duke of Clarence, Queen Victoria's own grandson. Whispers of royal conspiracy spread like wildfire in the press, suggesting the murders were part of a cover-up involving the throne itself. Most historians dismiss this theory as sensational nonsense, but its intrigue refuses to die. Each suspect seemed to carry the mask of the Ripper, if only for a moment. But the truth? Each time investigators pulled back the curtain, the evidence collapsed into shadows. And before I reveal how the murders suddenly came to a stop, let me remind you again, if you're fascinated by cases like this, hit that subscribe button and join us here on Vanished and Unsolved. Your support helps keep these mysteries alive. Because the most haunting part of this story isn't just who Jack the Ripper might have been, it's how he disappeared without a trace. After the brutal slaying of Mary Jane Kelly on November 9, 1888, something unexpected happened. The blood-soaked trail of Jack the Ripper went cold. There were no more canonical murders, no more taunting letters, just silence. Why did the killing stop? Some believed the Ripper died, perhaps even by his own hand. Others suggested he was imprisoned for an unrelated crime, his dark spree cut short by chance. Another chilling theory is that he simply moved on, continuing his horrors elsewhere, his identity swallowed by distance and time. There's also the possibility that the killer lost interest, that the very chaos he unleashed satisfied whatever dark craving drove him. Or perhaps, the police were closer to catching him than history remembers, forcing him into hiding. But the truth? No one knows. The sudden end to the murders is one of the greatest mysteries of all. A predator who held London in a grip of terror for months simply vanished into the fog, leaving only corpses and questions behind. And yet, the story didn't end there. For over a century, investigators, authors, and armchair detectives have tried to solve the riddle. Each generation brings new theories, new evidence, and new debates. Which brings us to the final chapter of this case, the legacy of Jack the Ripper and why his shadow still lingers over true crime today. The Jack the Ripper murders remain one of the darkest unsolved cases in history. More than 130 years later, his identity is still unknown, his name forever buried in speculation and myth. But Jack the Ripper is more than just a criminal case. He has become a symbol, a cultural ghost whose story shaped how the world thinks about crime. His murders forced police to rethink investigations, pushed newspapers into a frenzy of sensationalism, and inspired the birth of criminal profiling. Yet perhaps the most haunting part of his legacy is why the mystery endures. It's not only the brutality of the crimes, but the anonymity. The idea that someone could commit such horrors and vanish into history, faceless and nameless. That's why his shadow still lingers. Because every unsolved case since has carried a little of Jack the Ripper with it. A reminder that sometimes the darkest monsters are the ones we never truly see. And if you've made it this far, thank you for being here with me tonight. Don't forget to subscribe to Vanished and Unsolved so you never miss another chilling mystery like this one. In the autumn of 1888, the streets of Whitechapel echoed with fear. 5 women brutally murdered, a city paralyzed by terror, and a faceless figure whose name still strikes a chill more than a century later. Over 130 years later, Jack the Ripper still walks among the shadows of history. Do you believe he was ever truly caught? Or is the real Ripper's name forever lost to time? Share your thoughts in the comments below, because I'd love to hear your theories. And if this story left you haunted, stay tuned. We'll be diving into more mysteries that remain unsolved to this day. Until then, thank you for watching Vanished and Unsolved. Stay curious, stay safe, and remember, the shadows still hold secrets.